I feel like we're an inflection point in our history on many fronts. Racially, definitely the workplace, there's an inflection, that there's a crack and a fissure happening there. This capitalism that we're bolstered by politically. And I think the education system is really going to have to change. In your book, you start off, you said, from its inception, our higher education system was not built on equality or accessibility, but on educating and prioritizing white students. You said, it's a shameful secret. Let me just start. America's colleges and universities have a shameful secret. They have never given Black people a fair chance to succeed. All right, let's start with that. Because, Black women, it's rumored that, we have more degrees per capita than any other group in this country. Black people, especially folk that come here from other countries, to get a degree is important. We put that a high priority. Many of us are saddled with debt as a result of the many degrees that we have. And yet the system wasn't designed for us to even be in it. So give us a little history and then take us forward.
Yeah. So even going back before the founding of the country as a nation, right, there were attempts from states and others to stymie Black education, right? From 1740s, when you get some of the first laws that ban Black people from reading and make it a crime to teach a Black person how to read. And so you have sort of the succession of laws from there that are really just stymieing early Black education. But even in the face of that, right, Black people were thirsting for knowledge. They were thirsting for that education, thirsting to be able to read. Like after Nat Turner's rebellion, they literally barred Black people from even reading the Bible. It was like, because that knowledge, that additional that education was something they saw as potentially liberatory. So Black people could liberate themselves if they were to gain some of that knowledge. And so you see, and the reason why I point to, from its inception, this sort of higher education system as we recognize it today, is because not only, the Harvards and the Yales, which were established in the 1700s and 1600s, but from the foundation of the public education system as we recognize it today, the public higher education system, it was built on this idea of educating a white labor class. There were places to teach people the art of manslaying, as they called it. There were places to teach people how to be lawyers and doctors, but there weren't places to teach the farmers the arts and the scientists. And so what they do is they establish what are known as land grant institutions. So in the early 1860s, they passed the Morrill Act, which gives states land that was expropriated from Native Americans through murder and lopsided treaties, land that states could sell in order to fund these institutions. And that's how, Cornell gets its base of funding. That's how Iowa State gets its base of funding. And so you have basically states in these previously far-flung locales, from Auburn to Ames and elsewhere, they create these institutions that are almost exclusively for white people for the first at least 30 years of their existence, right? Iowa State was one of the first. Iowa was one of the first states to accept that land grant. They didn't enroll a Black student until 1890, and that was George Washington Carver. And that was only in part at the behest of the government saying, okay, if you're going to take this money, then you at least need to provide a separate option or enroll Black students in your institution. And so you started seeing a slow rolling cascade of first, but you also saw a sort of greater endowment of Black institutions when you get to 1890. But the catch there is, and of course there's always a catch, the only reason those 1890s got some of that money is because the predominantly white institutions wanted more money. So they had been going back to the federal government time and time again saying, we need more money to do what we need to do. Penn State, Michigan State, all of these major institutions were going back and asking for more money. And the federal government ultimately provided that money for those institutions. But at the same time, he said, you at least have to give some money to Black education as well. So that's what I'm really talking about when I'm saying that the underpinnings of our system, our public higher education system, were fundamentally built on that inequitable base.
So the HBCUs, mostly created by rich white benefactors, the Rockefellers and such, right? What was that about?
So there were a couple of different ways of thinking about how the HBCUs were founded. Of course, a mix of wealthy white philanthropists who had an idea of sort of kind of technical training or trade vocational training for Black people, so as not for them not to get into those other sort of professions. but you also, one of the reasons why I always caution people about this current wave of philanthropy is you see sort of the ebb and flow of philanthropy as, they think that Black people are getting a little bit too far ahead of themselves. So as you saw in the late 1800s or, late 1800s, early 1900s, where philanthropy, the American Missionary Association, other associations had really helped sustain some of these HBCUs, that all just kind of went away. When wealthy benefactors were like, that's not serving us anymore, that funding can go away very easily. But also at the same time, as you have philanthropists starting these institutions, you also have states during Reconstruction that start, or a mix of states and also professors or teachers who are coming back from having taught during some of the camps during the Civil War. So say the founders of Tennessee Manual Labor Institute, which was a college in Tennessee, an HBCU in Tennessee in the late 1860s, early 1870s. Tennessee Manual Labor was doing fantastic work, and it was two ministers who had taught at camps, Union camps during the Civil War, and they started an institution for Black students. But when they were going out looking for funding, philanthropists weren't down to fund them. The state, while it was funding 3 other private colleges for white students, when Tennessee Manual Labor was asking for funding, they were not provided with that funding. And so you really see not only the public institutions, but also how the private institutions had their reality shaped by the lack of funding from state and federal actors.
Adam Harris is here. The book is called The State Must Provide. We were talking about Muhammad Ali earlier. His birth name was Cassius Clay. There's a Cassius Clay in your book. Mm-hmm. Talk about that Cassius Marcellus Clay.
So Cassius Marcellus Clay, every person that he knew in his family held people in bondage. They were enslavers. And Cassius, when he went up to Yale, heard William Lloyd Garrison speak. And he said, his words sort of poured into me. And he became an abolitionist, right? This is a wealthy, land-owning white man who goes up to Yale, gets a little Northern education, comes back, and he's like, I'm an abolitionist now. And he gives his methods of abolition, right? There, whenever you talk about abolitionists, it's like, oh, well, they're the people who are wholesale against slavery. He was more of an incrementalist. His thought was it shouldn't be on the federal government to decide when states liberate people, but people should be liberated. Now, he was helping to fund someone who was far more active than he was in terms of the liberation of Black people. And that was John Fee. So Cassius Clay gives land to this Presbyterian minister, John Fee, who, wanted to create an institution coming out of the Bible, right? Acts chapter 2, verse 27, God had made of one blood all the people of the earth. And so he establishes, with this land given to him by Cassius Marcellus Clay, he establishes a college known as Berea College. And it's the first integrated coeducational college south of the Mason-Dixon. And in the South, right, there were really 2 integrated coeducational colleges in the South, and that was Maryville in Tennessee, but they came a little bit after. And it's interesting the way that Clay and Fee sort of differed, and it really shows right the levels of philanthropy that people were willing, or the mindset of philanthropists at the time, where it was like, okay, I'm willing to go to help you out to a certain point, but then I also hesitate to say that this uplift should go too far. But the nice thing with Clay was that, and in his sort of defense was, by giving this land to John Fee and letting John Fee do what he did and push the bar to where he pushed it, in some ways, that philanthropy and forward thinking actually propelled this institution, which now, right, it's still tuition free. It's been tuition free since 1892, and it's almost a 50-50 institution. So Berea is about 50% white, and a mix between about 27% Black students, a mix of Hispanic students, Asian students, international students. They're almost back to that 50-50. But, thinking about where they were in the late 1890s, there were about 187 Black students, 187 white students at Berea at that time, right? It was a legitimate 50-50 institution. And it was only broken apart by the state in 1904 banning integrated education. And the thing I often say, and this is the last point I'll make on this, is like, people often think about when states segregated education as being like so long ago. Like that was my, I'm pretty young. That was my granddad's like my granddad's dad was born before Alabama segregated education in law. And that was just 1901. So like that history and our proximity to it is actually so immediate.
Mm.
I think it's really interesting. I like to hear you talk about like this reliance upon philanthropy and how when we're talking about beneficial white people, how that can, not always work out in our favor. But the title of the book is The State Must Provide. And I'm just excited for people to really get into this, because I know for me, there was an article that came out, I think in April, talking about how much the state of Tennessee owes TSU. And it is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I know when we've had conversations, this is something I've talked with Karen about how do we even level the playing field when we talk about sports and athletic departments at HBCUs. And we're talking about a lack of funding always. And I think the general public thinks that it's a combination of like, foolishness happening amongst, HBCU administrators, that we don't have a lot of Black people that are wealthy that can give money back. But this is a state problem because they have systemically over generations withheld this money. We're talking again, this article says it could be anywhere from 151 million to 517 or something like that the state owes this school. So talk a little bit about that. How does that even happen where we have these schools that are at such a shortfall with money that the state owes them?
Yeah. And so like the Tennessee State example, right? That's just in matching funds that they were supposed to give to this institution from the federal land grant. So that's their acknowledgement that they're shafting them out of matching funds. But there are like all of these other ways that institutions have been have had their funding taken away. Alcorn State, when it was founded in 1871, they were told they were going to have a guaranteed appropriation of $50,000 a year for at least a decade. When the, so-called Redeemers swept back into office with their quote unquote revolution in 1875, they reduced that appropriation to $15,000 a year. A year later, 1876, they reduced that appropriation again to $5,500 a year. And then if you fast forward into the next century, Kentucky, when how states used to have this scheme of instead of creating graduate programs for Black students, they would just send them out of state. They would say, okay, we'll pay for you to go to Michigan or wherever it might be. But they never ultimately ended up sending that many students out of state. So Kentucky one year appropriated $5,000 to send students out of state. They spent less than $1,000 of that. But at the same time, they cut Kentucky State's budget by $5,000. And then on top of that, you mentioned all of the little things that have added up over time, how they've been shafted out of money. I often think about, that deferred maintenance over time at HBCUs, money that, if we had money, we could have updated the building. We could have fixed the thing that's hanging out from the ceiling. But that deferred maintenance is like it's like when you need a root canal. Like if you had a toothbrush, it's like, all right, cool. At the beginning, I'm gonna brush my teeth and I'm gonna be fine. If I can't brush my teeth, then I'm gonna have to go to the dentist. They're gonna tell me I have a cavity. And now I have to get a filling. I can't get the cavity filled because I don't have the money to fill that. So I'm gonna put it off for a little bit. I'll be fine. You go back to the dentist and they tell you need a root canal. And at that point, it's like, well, now I have to pay $3,000, or I could pay $3.50 for a toothbrush. And so like that wealth builds on itself over time. And it becomes even more necessary. It's like it becomes more expensive for states to fix their wrong. But as Amos T. Hall, a lawyer in Oklahoma, said in the 1940s, if it's expensive, that's not our fault. Like you created this inequitable system and it's on you. It's your responsibility to fix it.